Women continued to practice, but now they did so in fear of their lives. It was the testimony of male doctors that sent many to their deaths.
The witch burnings were a way to take control of women's powers of reproduction, which of course includes sexuality, and women's powers over reproduction, which could include midwifery, contraception, abortion, women's control of women's bodies and reproductive issues. This is part of a process of housewifization, of domestication of women that took place over several centuries, but it began in the same period as the witch burnings.
It was a time of social upheaval. As trade expanded, landowners pressed for the confiscation of peasant land. People rebelled as they were driven off their farms and into cities and towns. Those who demanded reform were branded enemies of God. Charges of witchcraft followed hot on the heels of peasant rebellions. Repression increased. Anyone considered helpless, mysterious, or aberrant was victimized, and punishments became public spectacles. Many suffered, but women suffered most of all. Those who spoke out wore the mask of shame. If they gathered in groups, they were plotting against men. Husbands were advised from the pulpit to beat their wives, not in rage, but out of charity for her soul. Those who made a dress too ornate wore the dressmaker's collar. Those who fell asleep in church, the rosary necklace. Others faced the ducking stool.
The mere fact that women are singled out particularly, I think, says something about our society, about our culture, which, to a large extent, is misogynist.
So, how does this affect us today? Well, the United States of America would not let women vote or own property. That would give them power in the society. And the Inquisition was all about taking away the people's power, especially the power of the feminine. So this transferred directly to the establishment of the United States of America.
We get it even in the New Testament, in the writings of St. Paul, that it is woman who introduces sin, it is woman who is the temptress. In a sense, it's woman who is the cause of the fall. So there's a very, very strong element of this, both in the New Testament and certainly right throughout the Christian period.
Guilt and sin were now part of every Christian's life. Sexuality was no longer a gift, but the root of all evil, and woman was the obstacle to man's holiness. From every pulpit, celibate priests declared that the end of the world was at hand. The pious would go to heaven, the wicked would burn in hell. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that next to contemplating God, the greatest pleasure for the blessed ones in heaven would be watching the tortures of the eternally damned. In the 14th century, the end of the world arrived in the form of the Black Plague. It was followed by a series of epidemics that swept across Europe for the next 200 years. The priests said it was God's punishment for sin, but their sacraments did not ease the suffering. People turned to the village wise woman in search of help and comfort.
Peculiar things happened at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century. Namely, it would seem that the female population increased more rapidly than the male population. Why this was so, it's difficult to ascertain. Possibly extensive war saw the decimation of male numbers. Some have argued that women were more immune to diseases that were rampant at the time, including the plague, so that you would develop this kind of disproportion within the population. Now, the importance of that in a patriarchal society is that women begin to outlive men, and not only that, women, because of their excessive numbers, do not find husbands. They don't marry and become, willy-nilly, independent. And in a patriarchal society, this is a very, very difficult thing to come to grips with.
By the 16th century, women's rights to inherit and own property had been eroded. Many women became dependent on charity for survival. Those who held on to their property were objects of suspicion and envy. At a time when life expectancy was 40 years, just being old was suspect. Widows, spinsters, and those who begged for a living were the most vulnerable to charges of witchcraft. They were easy scapegoats for communities plagued by war and disease.
So as people got kicked off their land was paid in tribute for the tribunals and got pushed into the city, they lost their autonomy. When you live on the land and you're farming, you can feed yourself. You know, you've got autonomy. As the nobles and the church claim the land as theirs and push people into the city, now people become dependent on being able to work for the nobles or for the church to survive, and they'll work for whatever they're offered so they can get the food. Does that sound familiar to a world we live in today? This is the foundation of capitalism. Those with capital control the system. They control the resources, they control the system of production for their interest at the cost of the people.
These were centuries of incredible strife, uncertainty, clash between Protestant and Catholic, and most important, a kind of groundswell of anti-clerical feeling. It strikes me that the witch craze is a kind of an answer for institutions which feel threatened. In other words, if one could convince the lower classes that their difficulties arose from the fact that witches were present and were blighting the harvests, were causing barrenness in the marriage bed, what have you, it would sort of take the pressure off the establishment. It's not.
And that is what a scapegoat is. Someone who is put up as the cause of a problem that is not the cause of the problem, that distracts the people from the people who are actually causing the problem. Can you think of anything in our world today that is doing that? Like maybe the families at the borders of the United States that have been brutalized for fleeing market expansion in their homes, in their towns, in their country, and they come here and we make them out to be the problem, the one that's causing all our problems, when we know outsourcing jobs to other countries to keep wages low and profits high, well, that's a big problem. We know these kind of things are problems, but we blame the innocent because that's what the system is holding up as our problem.
The state, it's not the Pope, it's not the bishop who is the cause of your anguish. It's the cursed presence of the witches.